And we are joined now by Marilyn Thompson of ProPublica. She has written one major piece and a follow-up piece as well on Jim Clyburn's role in working with Republicans to dilute black voting power in South Carolina, but to entrench his own power. Marilyn, thank you so much for coming on today to talk about your work in this area.
Thank you.
For sure. So, the Supreme Court last week or 2 weeks ago, I'm not sure, they heard oral arguments on the South Carolina redistricting case. But before we get into Clyburn's role here, talk a bit about what this case is about.
Well, the case was brought by the NAACP, and it alleged that South Carolina's congressional redistricting plan was a racial gerrymander. The original complaint cited a number of different congressional districts where they thought that gerrymandering had occurred illegally. The Republicans contended, of course, that there was no race involved in their decision, that this was all based on partisan politics, which is legal under the Supreme Court rulings. And so, you had a plan that basically had 7 congressional districts, which is what South Carolina has, and they were carved up in ways that the NAACP said they deliberately moved Black people to limit their political effectiveness.
And with these 7 districts, is there now only one district that is majority Black, and that is Clyburn's district?
That's correct. Jim Clyburn has held the Sixth Congressional District since 1992. And he was elected originally after the state legislature, under a court mandate, figured out a way to give Blacks in South Carolina a member of Congress. This had not been the case for many, many years. And the Black population of South Carolina is substantial, and at that point in time was about 1/3 of the population. So they carved out a district for one by Jim Clyburn that literally stretched across the state and roped in Black communities from Columbia, South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, and everything along the way. That district had a majority Black population, and it was the district that ensured that a Democrat, namely Jim Clyburn, could win and stay in office as the state turned increasingly Republican over the years.
So at its outset, Jim Clyburn's seat has been essentially a racially gerrymandered district, and for a long time, of course, you could blame the Republicans for that. Look, they're putting the Black voters into just Clyburn's district. This is kind of standard practice for the Republican Party.
Yeah.
But what's news and what's incredible that you broke over at ProPublica is just how involved it appears to have been Clyburn and his staff has been in maintaining the racial gerrymander that's kept him in power.
Yeah, I found it absolutely fascinating, and went into this not really knowing anything about Clyburn's role in this. I interviewed Congressman Clyburn in his office back in December of last year and asked him some questions about Republicans and what they were saying in South Carolina about how he had interfered in the process. And he got just furious talking about it. So I didn't know where I was going to go as I began looking into the court record. And what I found was fairly shocking to me. Yes, the Republican lawmakers who were running the redistricting conferred with Congressman Clyburn's staff. They brought in a map that was drawn to show what he wanted the 6th district to look like. And none of this was ever made publicly available, which is kind of shocking because the redistricting process is supposed to be a public process. They go to great lengths to travel around the state. In this case, they did what they called a road show, where lawmakers from these committees went around the state and held public hearings to get input from real people. But what I found was that the real dealing was going on in secret behind the scenes.
So I want to back up to I guess the Supreme Court overturning that part of the Voting Rights Act, which enabled this kind of racial gerrymandering to return in a really big way. I mean, it's always happened, but there's no federal oversight anymore. Did that shift anything in the relationship between Clyburn and some of these Republican lawmakers? Did it make it more shadowy?
Well, it's really interesting. And, you know, I'm not a Supreme Court reporter, and so I followed this developing law from kind of a distance. But, you know, what happened essentially was the court stepped in on some cases in other states and scaled back the protections of the Voting Rights Act in states like South Carolina. South Carolina, for the first time in 2021, did not have to submit any of its plans to the Justice Department to get pre-approval. And this is a big, big change in a state that has had a long history of racial discrimination and voting rights violations. So it was a new landscape. The legislature was on its own. They were free to pass whatever plan they wanted. But the Republicans were being very, very careful here because they did not want to be sued, as they ultimately were, on a racial gerrymandering claim. And so they deferred to Jim Clyburn. They testified in court that when Clyburn sent in his map and his special request, they'd bent over backwards to try to accommodate those. So, you know, it's a really changing landscape, developing law as the Supreme Court hears these redistricting cases. And the fact that they're now going to hear a three-judge panel's decision in the South Carolina case is really fascinating because it will help define the limits of racial gerrymandering and when a legislature has overstepped the law.
Is Clyburn's involvement being used in, I guess, the plaintiff's favor as a way to undercut the racism accusations?
Yes, that's what happened before the three-judge panel. And as I dug into the court record, I was really stunned by that. The legislators, the Republican legislators, were represented by a very eminent lawyer here in Washington, John Gore. He led the legal team. And as the case developed, the Republicans kept making the point. Jim Clyburn submitted his map. Jim Clyburn wanted these things. And it did create a very, finger-pointing way of accusing Clyburn of being part of the problem. At the NAACP, I interviewed them for my piece, and they clearly think that this is a case of Republicans trying to blame a Black elected official when they were, in fact, the one with racist intent.
Yes, his intent was just, and I'm editorializing here, just a careerist, which, I mean...
Yeah. I mean, it was really interesting to me to talk to people emerging in the South Carolina Democratic Party as potential candidates, because there's a very different generational vibe that you get here. Clyburn's generation and others who were, coming up during the Voting Rights Act, they enjoyed those protections. and they tried very hard to keep their districts majority Black. The new generation of Black leader, and I quoted a guy named Bakari Sellers that he's widely believed to be a contender for Clyburn's seat when and if the congressman decides to step down. But Mr. Sellers' view is you don't need 50+% Blacks to win these days. And so spread out the Black Democrats, let other congressional districts have part of that dedicated Democratic vote. And that way you create more of a likelihood that you'll have more representation.
Mm. I mean, that's also just that's more democratic, right? As opposed to being, I guess, in the interests that Sellers is contending there of the Democrats in the state. It's also just the right thing to do and what the party is supposedly in favor of. But it's just, I think the implications are so important of this being Clyburn who's involved in this, given his stature within the Democratic Party and the fact that he's the head of the Congressional Black Caucus. Can you talk about that angle to it, and the Congressional Black Caucus's importance in this particular debate and discussion?
Yeah, I mean, the views of the Black Caucus have also evolved. Congressman Clyburn was the head of the Black Caucus years ago, back when majority Black districts were the fight. That's what they were trying to create all across America. And as a result of that, the Black Caucus was able to amass greater numbers and more influence in the Congress. But those times have changed. And when you have a congressman like Jim Clyburn, who literally is, he's one of the most famous people in South Carolina, who has a following across the state, both Black and white, you have to wonder, does he need 52% Blacks in his district, or could he win with less?
Right.
And everybody believes he could win with less. I interviewed one of his friends from the old days, a former congressman in North Carolina, Mel Watt, fascinating guy. He said Jim Clyburn could win with 20% Black votes. So, it's a changing dynamic. And as you said, it's one of the critical questions about how we shape our democracy.
Absolutely. I mean, I am interested to see what the fallout is from this, given that much of the Democratic leadership that Clyburn hit, the whole team that he was a part of. I mean, he was the number 3 to Steny Hoyer and Nancy Pelosi. They're on the outs at this point, and that they're beginning to cede power, at least we hope. Although their influence is still very great, it's going to be interesting to see that generational divide play out as you describe.
Yeah, I'm going to be watching it very closely. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in my reporting is look at redistricting more broadly. Everybody agrees this is one of the critical threats to democracy, like the fact that state legislatures can determine who's going to sit in Congress, and that we just saw an election in the last cycle where gerrymandering in different states played a critical role in giving Republicans a very slender majority. And so I'm trying as a reporter to kind of get to the root of that. What is happening? And it's hard because the Clyburn story, as you may have detected, required a lot of reporting in the court record and interviewing dozens of people in the state to get a feel of how that worked.
Right. Lastly, is this, in your opinion, more indicative of Southern Black Democrats' alliance with Republicans in their state, then I mean, or I guess, are there other examples of this that are eventually kind of going to get uncovered where Democrats are kind of okay with their seat being so heavily gerrymandered, even if Black voters in these red states are not represented as broadly as they should be?
I think it is playing out in a number of southern states. And it's playing out not just at the congressional level, but at the legislative level. The South Carolina legislature, also went through a gerrymandered process for its redistricting. And a number of elected Black officials lost their seats because Republicans in the back rooms figured out a way to draw the district so that they wouldn't be elected. And so it's a hot issue. And I do believe that, especially if journalists begin probing the details of what's going on in the horse trading, who's doing what, we are going to see more examples.
Well, thanks so much for your reporting on this. It's really excellent work. I mean, ProPublica, you guys just doing incredible work over there between this and the Clarence Thomas story.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your work, Marilyn Thompson. You can check out the pieces that she's written about Jim Clyburn in the description below. We'll link to both of them, and wherever you're listening to this, it should be there. Thank you so much, Marilyn.
Thank you.